Today marks 100 years since British women got the right to vote. But the fight for women's rights in Britain stretches back centuries before that. So let's take a brief history. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, there were signs of discontent among some British women. Not yet organised or vocal enough to be called a movement. But women were beginning to question their place in a society that offered them few rights or opportunities. At the time, women could not own property or enter most professions. They couldn't vote, and their voices were rarely heard in public life. However, by the end of the 19th century, several organisations had sprung up advocating for women's rights. The Married Women's Property Act of 1882 represented a significant step forward, granting married women legal autonomy over their own assets and earnings. It was a hard-won battle, one that showed just how much needed to be done. A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft, published in 1792, was a foundational text in the fight for women's rights in Britain. Wollstonecraft, a writer and philosopher, argued passionately for women's access to education and reason. She believed that denying women the right to an education and to participate in public life diminished society as a whole. Wollstonecraft's ideas may have been radical for their time, but they planted seeds of thought among a small but growing number of intellectuals and reformers. Though there wasn't an immediate mass movement sparked by her work, her influence can be seen in the actions of those that followed. The drive for women's suffrage in Britain during the late 19th and early 20th centuries was led by two main factions, each employing distinct strategies to achieve their goals. The first group, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, also known as the Suffragists, was founded in 1897 by Millicent Fawcett. This organization favored a more moderate and constitutional approach to achieving suffrage. The suffragists believed in working within the existing political system, employing tactics such as organizing petitions, holding public meetings, peaceful demonstrations, and lobbying members of parliament. They believed that through reasoned argument and persistent pressure, they could convince the government to grant women the right to vote. Their motto was, "Deeds, not words," emphasizing their commitment to patient and purposeful campaigning, rather than more confrontational methods. The other faction, the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, founded in 1903 by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, took a more militant approach. Known as the suffragettes, they employed tactics such as heckling politicians, chaining themselves to railings outside government buildings, smashing windows of businesses that opposed women's suffrage, and setting fire to pillar boxes, empty buildings, and even golf courses. They organized large public demonstrations, and when arrested, many went on hunger strike, which often ended with brutal force-feeding by prison authorities. This drew considerable public sympathy and outrage. To avoid deaths in custody, the British government passed the Prisoners' Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act, also known as the Cat and Mouse Act, in 1913, which allowed weakened prisoners to be released only to be rearrested when they recovered. One of the most shocking incidents during this time was Emily Wilding Davison's attempt to pin a suffragette banner to the King's horse at the Epsom Derby in 1913. She was killed when the horse bolted, though her death was accidental in nature. It became a powerful symbol of the lengths women were willing to go to for the cause. As World War I broke out in 1914, the WSPU largely suspended its militant campaign to support the war effort. Women stepped into traditionally male-dominated roles working in factories, on farms, and in auxiliary services. This demonstrated not only their capability, but also their patriotism and vital contribution to national life. After the war, this new recognition failed to translate into voting rights immediately. However, the post-war political landscape and the recognition of women's war efforts made it increasingly difficult to deny them the vote. Finally, in 1918, the Representation of the People Act passed, granting the vote to women over 30 who met minimum property qualifications or were married to men who did. This partial victory was a step in the right direction, showing that progress was possible, but also highlighting the inequalities that remained. It was another 10 years before women achieved full suffrage. On July 1928, the Equal Franchise Act finally granted women the right to vote on the same terms as men. At the age of 21, lowered to 18 in 1969. The long, arduous fight for the ballot box was finally over. But it wasn't the end of the story. The vote didn't dismantle all barriers overnight. Women still faced systemic discrimination in employment, education, and social attitudes. And the fight for true equality continued. The mid-20th century saw what's often referred to as the second wave of feminism. Emerging in the 1960s and lasting until the 1980s, this phase of feminist activism focused on issues like equal pay, access to contraception and abortion, and challenging patriarchal structures that limited women's roles and opportunities. Key pieces of legislation were introduced during this time to address some of these issues. The Equal Pay Act of 1970, which came into force in 1975, aimed to end the disparity in pay between men and women for the same work. The Sex Discrimination Act of 1975 made discrimination on the grounds of sex unlawful in employment, education, and access to goods, facilities, and services. And the Abortion Act of 1967 legalized abortion in Britain under certain circumstances, a landmark decision that gave women greater control over their reproductive rights. Second wave feminism also critically examined how traditional gender roles and the objectification of women were ingrained in society. Thinkers and activists like Germaine Greer, whose book The Female Eunuch was published in 1970, sparked widespread debate and discussion about these issues. Throughout this period, women's groups and consciousness-raising circles proliferated, addressing issues like domestic violence, which was often hidden and unaddressed. The setting up of refuges for women fleeing abusive situations was a significant development during this time. The second wave of feminism was instrumental in bringing these issues to the forefront of public discourse and pushing for legislative change. But it also laid the groundwork for future waves of feminism. By highlighting the need to address the diverse experiences of women across different backgrounds and identities, by the 1990s, the feminist movement began to diversify, giving rise to the third wave of feminism. This wave, which lasted until the early 2000s, challenged the limitations of the second wave, which critics argued was largely focused on the experiences of white, middle-class women and didn't adequately address the issues faced by women of color, LGBTQ+ women, and women from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Third wave feminism emphasized intersectionality, acknowledging that women's experiences are shaped by multiple identities and that oppression is multifaceted. It also reclaimed femininity, challenging the idea that being feminine was inherently anti-feminist. And it used cultural means like popular music and art to express feminist ideas and critiques. Additionally, the third wave brought attention to global issues like FGM and human trafficking, recognizing that women worldwide face similar struggles and demanding global solutions. The fourth wave of feminism, emerging around the 2010s, is heavily influenced by digital technology and social media. This wave has seen the use of hashtag campaigns like #MeToo, #EverydaySexism, and #TimesUp to mobilize people rapidly on an international scale. These campaigns have enabled women to share their personal stories and experiences, raising global awareness about issues like sexual harassment and assault. The fourth wave continues to address issues from previous waves, while also focusing on contemporary challenges like body positivity and mental health.